Hello, class. Welcome to the Introduction to Literature class. Like I told you in my two emails to you this morning, the first one intimating you about the inclement weather forecast, uh, positioning that classes might be constricted to just some few minutes and then the subsequent closure of the school at 1 p.m. And then my last email to you intimating you that this would have to be a recording class. Well, it's imperative that we do this because, like I told you in the email, I don't want us to defer the class, neither do I want us to forfeit the class. So here we are. Thank you for listening to this. Okay, so today what we are supposed to do in class is poetry, the traditional, the exploratory, the experimental, and the revolutionary kind of poetry. And as potential writers, as potential scholars of literature, it's important for us to take things from the basics, from the genesis, and then try to navigate to the present and see how poetry as a genre of literature had evolved. Okay, the glasses. Yes, you haven't seen me with this in the class. It's because when I read prints very closely, those wordings begin to dance in my eyes. So that's why I'm using glasses. All right. So our materials for this week, as we know, are already posted on Brightspace, and I hope we have all interacted with those materials, and we have gone ahead, like I always told you in the class, to get further materials with which to interact with, so that we come to the class and process knowledge together. But ideally, let's start today's understanding with the question, that very difficult question that we have always asked in the class when we are engaging topics. What is poetry? This is a very difficult question. Maybe some decades ago, centuries ago, it would have been an outright easy question to answer, but now it has become very difficult. When we talk about, poetry is the kind of writings in verses, poetry is the kind of writings that have fragmented meanings or figurative meanings. Those meanings had evolved over time. And then we start wondering, what really can we call poetry? Like I told you about 2 weeks ago, that for me, I would always state that poetry is the kind of writing that rests substantially on connotations. Anything apart from that, you could add bits and pieces from any other thing. But that is the fundamental, the essential definition of poetry for me. A kind of writings, a kind of literary genre that rests substantially on connotations. You know, like I always told you in the class, it's not like my definition is a given. But for me, that forms the very crux of what we understand as poetry. Even when we are reversing our thoughts about the understanding of poetry from the classical to the contemporary times. And then we ask ourselves another question related to that. What kind of poetry do we have? Again, that's also a difficult question because we will move from the traditional kinds of poetry, the narrative, elegy, epic, dirge, sonnet, free verse, blank verse, to more contemporary kind of poetries, which are difficult to define. And of course, we will want to categorize spoken word poetry in those categories. So what I'm saying is that defining poetries and defining the meaning of poetry and trying to delineate the kind of poetries or type of poetries that we have has increasingly become a difficult task for both scholars and for learners. But we as students of introduction to literature, the thing here is that we should just always take the basics to actually carve our thoughts in defining some of those things. For instance, if I am defining poetry, like I told you, it will be that is a kind of writing that rests substantially on connotation. Every other things are actually appendages. That is for me. And this is the kind of thought that I always encourage students to go ahead and start formulating in their own process of getting knowledge. Okay, now let's move specifically to the materials that we have for this week. Let's start with that short YouTube video, what's the title again? The short YouTube video that we watched. What makes a poem a poem? It's a short video by Melissa Kovacs. In that video, we would see what Melissa is trying to do with that short lesson. How do we classify poem? How do we say this kind of writing is a poem and this kind of writing is not a poem? So Melissa expose us more to the ambiguity in the definition of poetry. She talks about poetry having language and musical qualities up to having condensed languages and up to the point where we begin to have difficulties when we try to analyze songs and music. When we try to analyze songs, we find we're also talking about poetry here. So that is what Melissa is trying to say, that it has become increasingly difficult to give an outright definition to poetry. And then you will see where she's saying, are songs to be considered poetry? And she gave some definitive examples, brought out some evidences from some songs, from some musicians that are actually poetry. And she actually substantiated that in her video, that those writings could be classified as poetry. I consistently state in class that we need to keep re-examining the Nobel Prize Literature that Bob Dylan won in 2016. Like it was unfathomable for some people that a musician won the Nobel Prize. But I have an argument that the winning was not based on his song compositions, but on his songwritings, on the lyrics he had composed, on the lyrics he had written, on those verses he had created, on the pages of papers which were giving melodies to become music. That had been my argument, and I think that is one of the things Melissa Kovacs tries to tell us in that short video, what makes a poem a poem. She also extended her argument by saying even this day we could consider tweeting, some tweets, as works of poetry. Orators, people delivering oration. These are some of the things that experimentation and contemporary expansion of knowledge had situated in our understanding of literature, specifically poetry. So I enjoy you guys. Please watch and rewatch that video. It makes a lot of sense in provoking our knowledge to what poem really is. What makes a poem a poem? And then let's move now backwards to our classical understanding of poetry. When we go to ancient Greece and we see when writers achieved that level of excellence, that works were beginning to be delineated into genres and categories. And those were what led to the traditional systematization of literary genres. In those classical periods where we have the works of Homer in Greece, the works of Chaucer in England, you will see that there are certain standards attained by these writers, standards which are regarded as levels of excellence in writing. So those things formed the foundation that transmitted over periods into what actually enhanced the development of writing, enhanced the development of literary genres, and enhanced the development of poetry. So what I'm saying in essence is that even as at today, when we try to look at music as a form of poetry, when we try to look at tweets as a form of poetry, when we try to look at oration as a form of poetry, we still try to look for those elements, the sublime essence of figurative use of language in those things. That is when we can completely say, oh, this is poetry. And we see in those times, those standards are stipulated as the model for writing. We will see some of this model when we consider some of the poems that we have in our material listed for study today. Now, let's move from those level of grandeur from the classical ages. We begin to move to the more traditional and more systemized form of writing, where writers are not considered to be the only conclave of knowledge. That writers are not the only intellectuals in the society. We move into the more contemporary, not the contemporary, the modern society, where we begin to have poems coming from all areas, coming from all settings, coming from different parts of the world, and coming with their own sensibility in their writings. And then those were the eras that inform some of the materials that we are dealing with today. Let's look at the first work. Let's look at John Bunyan's The Shepherd Boy's Song. The title is actually The Shepherd Boy's Song is an abridged title. The full title is The Shepherd Boy's Song in the Valley of Humiliation, and is contained in a collection which is titled The Pilgrim's Progress. So let's read. Let's see what John Bunyan is trying to do here, and we'll try to give a little bit of literary and sociological understanding and meaning into what John Bunyan has written. He states, "He that is down need fear no fall. He that is low, no pride. He that is humble ever shall have God to be his guide. I am content with what I have, little be it or much. And Lord, contentment still I crave, because thou savest such. Fullness to such a burden is, that go on pilgrimage. Here little, and hereafter bliss is best from age to age." So you could look at the way he has formatted his writing. And yeah, quite understandably, in those days, poetry works transform seamlessly into songs. And for some of us who are probably into liturgical studies, or who have been brought up in the liturgical sense, we probably have heard this poetry turned into song or being sung somewhere in the church or in a kind of liturgical setting. You know, he that is down need fear no fall. He that is low no pride. He that is humble ever shall have God to be his guide. So seamlessly, that poem transits into song. But let's see the structure of the poem. Look at the first stanza. Of course, traditionally from classical, apart from the epic and the more narrative kind of poetry, the classical structuring of poetry that steeps into the more traditional is that poems are written in stanzas. And traditionally, the stanzas are in 4 lines. And then there are things that are completely cognate to those 4 lines. You see rhythm, you see a rhyme, you feel the sound, you feel the melody, and you feel those things telling stories little by little. So you see, he that is down need fear no fall. Fall. That's at the end of the first line. He that is low no pride. End of the second line, pride. He that is humble ever shall. Third line, have got to be his guide. Guide. Fourth line. So the end of the last word in the first line, fall. The last word in the third line, shall. The last word in the second line, pride. The last word in the last line, in the last line of the first stanza, guide. So you could see this rhyme scheme, the melodic rhyme scheme. Fall, pride, shall, guide. If I'm taking them two, I'll say fall, shall, pride, guide. Fall, shall, pride, guide. So that is the notion with which poems are written structurally in the traditional sense. And you'll see that the poem itself is telling certain stories. The story of probably a shepherd boy or a very common person who, even in his or her state of commonality, okay, is a he, who in his state of commonality has also been able to imbibe the character of humility into his lifestyle. Like, yes, even though I am a common person, I still want to remain who I am. I want to be free with people. I don't want to have this grandeur positioning of myself. I don't want to have too much materialities and physical things to my name. I just want to live a normal life, and I want to be good to people, and I want to be with the Lord and understand the ways of the Lord and live in that sense on the level of just being ordinary. So this is like a romantic understanding of life. And when we move from that classical sense that I earlier talked about, most traditional poets, the very early modern, are actually romantic writers. And when I say romantic writers, I mean writers whose writing appeals actually tends to affect feelings more than any other emotion. Affect feelings, maybe feelings of love, maybe feelings of sympathy to things, maybe feelings of, the realistic side of life, the core existential side of life are pushed to the side, and the romantic sides, the sides that appeal to feelings are actually pushed out. So these are some of the things that those early modern poets tried to do in their works. Let's move to the second poem. Let's see Alfred Lord Tennyson's Sweet and Low. And for me, I have loved this poem right from when I was very, 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 when I was a child. I loved this poem. You could see what Alfred Lord Tennyson has written in Sweet and Low. He states, sweet and low, wind of the western sea, low, low, breathe and blow, wind of the western sea, over the rolling waters go, come from the dying moon and blow him again to me, while my little one, while my pretty one sleeps. Sleep and rest, Father will come today soon. Rest on mother's breast. Father will come today soon. Father will come to his babe in the next. Silver sails all out of the west under the silver moon. Sleep, my little one. Sleep, my pretty one. Sleep. You would have been wondering, what kind of poem is this that sounds like a lullaby? Of course, it's a lullaby. It's also translated into music. But what we are saying is, what structuring is Alfred Lord Tennyson trying to play around with here. You could see those rhyme scheme there, the melodic sense of the poem. Low, low, sea, blow, sea, go, blow. Those are the kinds of experimentation that traditional poets tries to put in their works. It's standard, the rhyme schemes, the melodic sense, those are standards when we talk about traditional sense of poetry. And here we could see that Alfred Lord Tennyson writes in octave, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He wrote in two stanzas, and each one is an octave. An octave is an 8-line poem. When we consider the earlier poem that we dealt with by John Bunyan, the Shepherd Boy song, he actually wrote in quatrain in 4 lines. 4 lines form a stanza, quatrain. And then Alfred Lord Tennyson does an 8-line beat, which is an octave. So these are the kind of engagements when we think about the traditional sense of poetry writing. Standard, those standards have criteria, and those criteria, those traditional poets are tempted to adhere to those criteria, rhyme in stanzas, in certain number of lines, while continuing to tell their stories. Alfred Lord Tennyson here is trying to tell the story of a mother rocking a baby, or maybe breastfeeding a baby, and at that instance also singing to the baby, singing to the baby about the adventure of the supposed father of the baby, who is probably a sailor and had gone out to the sea, and he's saying, don't worry, the wind will blow your father back. Your father is on the seas, over the rolling waters, but the wind will breathe and blow him back. So this is a kind of romanticization of the human ideal that Alfred Lord Tennyson also tries to inspire in his works. Now, let's move on. Here we go to Africa, and we examine in the third material a poem titled Lest We Should Be the Last, written by the Ghanaian poet Kwesi Brew. So let's see what Kwesi Brew is trying to say here. Kwesi Brew says, lest we should be the last to appear before you. We left our corn in the barn, and unprepared we follow the windy way to your heart. Our children begged for water from the women bearing golden gods on their heads and laughing on their way from the well. But we did not stop, knowing that in your presence our hunger would be banished and our thirst assuaged by the flowing milk of your words. Now we have come to you and are amazed to find those who have loved and respected mock you in your face. Now you could see a different tone here. Now, we are living the early traditional fashioning of poetry. We are moving to the more traditional, the 20th century, the 21st, the late 20th century kind of inspiration that goes with poetry writing. And here, most poets began to relieve themselves of those standard structure that are inscribed in the traditional sense of poetry writing. No more adhering to some rhyme scheme, no more trying to be melodic, no more trying to have certain stanzas which must be adhered to. You could see in the first stanza here, Kwesi Brew wrote the first stanza in 5 lines, and you could see the second stanza was in 9 lines, and then the last stanza was in 3. So it's a mishmash of arrangement when it comes to the stanzas, and this is experimentation. These are what occupied the late 20th century poets, both around the globe, in Africa, in Europe, in America, Australia, everywhere in Asia. Poets began to be dismissive of those criteria that had been ascribed to traditional poetry. So they began to experiment, they began to tell their stories, and you could see the use of words. He was writing like it's a narrative, but breaking it into stanzas, breaking it into lines, using verse words, but then not adhering to any tenets that had been prescribed as traditional in the poem writing fashion. And here he's telling us a story about a people going to meet a certain person with expectation. Like, yeah, we are going to go to this person. We are leaving our works behind, leaving our homes behind, leaving everything behind. Things that should occupy us, we are leaving it behind. We've got to meet this person. It's like this person is a sage. We've got to meet this person, and we know when we get to this person, so many questions will be answered, so many relief will be provided, and then they got to the person, and then they meet with what they weren't expecting. Those you have loved and respected mock you in your face. That itself is figurative. Who are those that you have loved and respected? And the poem can be interpreted also in that figurative sense. Like people waiting for a certain savior, and then the savior comes. Savior now in the sense of a country transiting from chaos and having a new leader who people had thought is the savior, is going to save our country, and then the person gets there and they found out, no, this person is not it. This is not our savior. This is also a destroyer. You know. So you could interpret the poem that way. You could interpret it from the aspect which I think Kwesi Brew was trying to write, of transiting from colonialism, when the white invaders are leaving or had left Africa, and then the regime of government are transferred to Africans themselves. And the expectation is that now things will be different. Now we are no longer being moved around by overlords. Now we have someone who is us in the position of power. But then everything that was coming down from that person in position of power is no different from what had been, or what they had suffered from the hands of the white invaders, from the hands of the colonialists. So it's like the poem is strictly a poem of disillusionment. No more romanticizing the society. No more trying to paint the picture of an ideal society. Now, modern poets, the late 20th century poets, apart from experimenting with structures, apart from experimenting with writings, they are much more realistic with their writings. They are facing those prevalent situations of their societies and writing poetry on those things. So most of those things, most of those poetries of those times, you see imagery of disillusionment, imagery of chaos, imagery of trauma. You know, those were the imageries in those poems. The era of romanticism seemed to have been dead. So that is the sense in which Kwesi Brew's work was written. Let's move to the last poem, Introduction to Poetry. Now, this is more contemporary. We are even moving from the late modern, late 19th century, late 20th century, to the more contemporary, to the modern. And the title of it, the poem itself, suggests that this is someone who has decided to rupture the sense of the traditional. You know, this is the era of experimentation when it comes to writing poems. Introduction to Poetry. That is the title of the poem, and that itself suggests resistance, it suggests experimentation, it suggests radicalism. And those are the hallmarks of poetry that we study these days. You could see introduction to poetry. Let's read Billy Collins' poem. He writes, I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water sky across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. You could see what Billy Collins is trying to do here. He's not only writing poetry, he's actually speaking against the traditional sense of studying poetry. He is speaking against the traditional sense of writing poetry. And he's also speaking against the traditional sense of understanding poetry. Here he's telling us that poetry should be poetry. Writing poetry should just be for the writing's sake. It should just be for you to enjoy it. You don't need to put a light and start looking for anything in poetry. You don't need to look for a rhyme scheme. You don't need to look for meaning. You don't need to look for connotation. You don't need to look for anything. Just enjoy poetry. And that is poetry. This is what Billy Collins is trying to say in this poem. And you could see in the structuring of the poem, everything seems to be in a disheveled form, which itself is an experiment. You see, the first stanza, if I could even call it a stanza, is in 3 lines. And next we have 1 line. And then we have 2 lines, followed by another 2 lines. And then we have 3 lines, followed by another 3 lines. And then we have 2 lines. He's just trying to experiment. And that is what contemporary poets are doing. But what we are saying is that whether you write in the traditional sense, whether you write in the early modern sense, whether you write in the late modern sense, whether you write in the contemporary, more radical sense, what we are saying is that poetry, like I said in my definition, is a kind of writing that rests substantially on connotation. And I think that is some of the things that Billy Collins is trying to say here. That just enjoy poetry. Even if it's in connotation, don't find the meaning. Don't look for verse. Don't look for rhymes. Don't look for stanzas. Just enjoy poetry because it's meant to be enjoyed. Now, let's go back to the end bit of that first video that we watched. The first material that we examined, what makes a poem a poem. We could see the fundamental assertion that Melissa Kovacs actually exerts towards the end bit of that video. She says, the waters of poetry run wide and deep. The waters of poetry run wide and deep. Poetry cannot be confined into certain space. When we say there is structure, when we say there is the kind of story that must be written, when we say it must be understood via this means or categorized via this means, we are just trying to limit poetry because the waters of poetry run wide and deep. And then she continues the narrative. Poetry has evolved over time. And that is what we are trying to understand here. Actually, in most of the things we are studying, from the traditional to the evolutionary to the more contemporary to experimentation to the radical, those are the things we are trying to examine because there has been evolutions around all this genre over centuries. And she says, and perhaps now more than ever, the line between poetry, prose, song, and visual art has blurred. The line between poetry, prose, song, and visual art has blurred, the lines are beginning to be invisible. People write poetry now like they are writing prose. People write prose sometimes like they are writing poetry. People write drama like it's poetry. You sing songs and you will think this person is just doing poetry. I have seen someone sang poetry. Nowadays, we have spoken word poetries everywhere. So the lines in all this genre are beginning to be blurred. It is actually the author who could say, okay, this is what I'm setting out to write. And it is in the writer's province to define the genre either ways he or she likes. But there are standards, like I always say, there are standards. Some things must delineate a genre from the other. Poetry, complete connotation. If you write a narrative, prosaic narrative, 10, 20 pages and is in complete connotation, I wouldn't take that as a prose. I would take that as poetry. If you write poetry of 3 pages in complete prosaic manner, I wouldn't take that as poetry. I would take that as a prose because it's a narrative written seamlessly in prosaic manner. Those are standards. Those are characteristics that are endured over time, that evolutions, experimentation had not even been able to change. If you write poetry and you put character names and you put their dialogues on it, and I keep saying that, for me, you are written a drama, not a poem. Those are standard features that experimentation will not change, standard features that evolutions will not change. If those features, standard features, were to be changed, then we wouldn't be discussing genres at all. We would just be discussing flat literature. In other words, having those standards that defines and characterize each genre is not a definition of the genre. Those are just the main characteristics of those genre. Like, okay, every living thing's breathe. Every living thing's breathe. So if every living thing's breathe, it does not mean every living thing is human. Humans must have certain standard characteristic features that make them human. So that is what I am trying to say when we consider those genres. So for poems, for me, it is that standard connotative or figurative use of language. Yes, you could come in and start putting bits and pieces to the definition, but that is the standard. That standard must be embedded in any ways that you are defining literature. So that is our work for today, examining poetry as a learner of literature in our understanding and introduction to literature. Poetry seemed for me to have that evolution, both in genre definition and both in its own specific definition. That is the evolution. So today, those lines that makes those categories that made the definition so visible are thinned out. We are now in an age where people have attained that standard of knowledge, that standard and style of writing, that they are broken loose from those constraining features that had come with our understanding of poetry from the classical era. So, class, that is what we will do today. Yeah, I have already made 40 minutes. I was thinking this shouldn't be more than 20 minutes. On Monday, we should be preparing for our discussion cafe. Remember, 5 questions. Let's look for 5 provocative questions around the issue of poetry. What are those questions that are provocative to us? What are those questions that are germane for us to actually ventilate in the class? What are those questions that we need to put in the midst of our process of actualizing knowledge in the classroom. We want those 5 questions, and I'll be waiting on you till Friday, 11:59 p.m. for you to send in the questions. 2 marks for sending questions, and please, let's make sure they are provocative questions. Let's go back to all those materials. Let's read them, because this is not a full-fledged class. This is just some kind of navigating through those materials and trying to ventilate aspects of those materials. Go back to those materials, read them, read the backgrounds of those materials, go for other materials like I consistently tell you in the class. Read materials that are away from those that are prescribed for each class. Read other materials that come your way but that are cogent to the topic of discussion. We meet on Monday for our discussion cafe. Questions, 5 questions, and I will be waiting for the 5 people who will be volunteering as our table secretaries on Monday. And finally, it's an inclement weather. Please stay indoor and keep warm. Thank you. I'll see you guys on Monday. Bye. Thanks.